I'm the Executive Director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Welcome to our space and the IBM Innovation Studio space. We meet with clients from the US and around the world, partners here, do all kinds of briefings and events, and we're happy to have you here today. We are especially happy to be co-presenting today's session with our partners at the Institute for the Study of War, and I'll introduce my colleague, Kim Kagan, momentarily. But first, just a few words. Our center, many of you know, it's a think tank inside IBM. We're independent of the business. We work predominantly with academic experts and nonprofit leaders who are experts in their field in addressing problems and challenges that face the US government, that face government leaders around the world. And we produce reports like the one we're going to be releasing today that you're getting the first view of. And by the time that this is over, we will have copies of the report out on the table for you to take with you as well. And we'll be able to hold up a copy. Ruth, can you hold up a copy of it? Here's the report, hot off the presses for you. And you'll be able to take them away. But we're so happy. We would like this to be a really interactive session. We have a terrific agenda. We'll hear from presenters of the report. We'll hear from a panel of experts about the topic of information operations, visualizing those and how important that is to the conduct of warfare and deterrence and strategy in the 21st century. And we'll encourage Q&A all the way through. It is a hybrid meeting. We will be doing our panel. We'll be joined by a distinguished leader at the Indo-Pacific Command headquarters in Oahu at that point. And then we'll also have our closing panel. We'll be beaming in somebody from Orlando, Florida, who's at a conference there. So a couple of logistics notes. In case you need to use a restroom, the way you came in, just go out the doors, turn left, and then there will be somebody to let you back in. We are required to say that if there is an alarm of fire or anything else in the building, I will raise my hand. You'll follow me. We'll go find a place across the street. This actually happened once. We went to the Willard. We sat in the bar, we had a drink. Again, I appreciate you coming. We really look forward to an active discussion. And let me introduce the president of the Institute for the Study of War, Kim Kagan.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thanks to all of you here in the room and out in the wider world. It is a great pleasure to be here today to introduce the work of a project that has been very dear to us at the Institute for the Study of War. Now, some of you have rightly asked, what is the Institute for the Study of War? So I will tell you. The Institute for the Study of War is a nonprofit organization located here in Washington, D.C. We are 15 years old, and we have a unique dual mission. The first is to produce highest quality open source intelligence analysis on conflicts that really matter to the United States and its allies. And the second mission that we have is to raise the next generation of national security leaders to help fix the problems that we're not necessarily going to be able to fix in a single presidential administration, or indeed in many. And to that end, you may be familiar with our work because our daily analysis of the conflict in Ukraine has been featured quite widely and has made ISW the most cited think tank in DC and possibly, therefore, in the world. Through the media mentions of the outstanding maps of our geospatial intelligence team, our Russia analytic team, and we also have a China analytic team and a great Middle East team. The reason I am introducing ISW as an institution is that we are extremely proud to partner with organizations such as the IBM Center for the Business of Government and other leaders in innovation. Because that innovation really powers the work that we do and our ability to do open source intelligence at scale, but also to imagine new ways of doing business that can assist us meet our mission to aid decision makers, war fighters, and on some occasions, the general public. And the work that we did together on this project, managing the new era of deterrence and warfare, visualizing the information domain, actually emerged from the work that ISW's Russia-Ukraine team was doing over the course of 2021 and 2022, as we observed the interaction between Russian information campaigns, Kremlin information campaigns, and the situation on the ground in and around Ukraine. And one of the things that is so important to me and so important to all of us is to wrestle with how is it that we can convey some of what is happening in these more abstract areas with what's physically happening on the battle space at any given time. And so we were so fortunate to meet Dan and to encounter the wonderful IBM team and launch together a project that we're proud to present to you today.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks also to Leendert von Bochoven, who's here, right here in front of me, who was one of the inspiration, my colleague at IBM, and Steve Gordon, who's actually in Orlando, who were the inspirations working with Fred Kagan, who we'll be introducing momentarily, and Kim to create this, and of course, Brian Babcock-Lumish, the lead author of the report, and a great team of ISW co-authors, several of whom are here in the room. So they've done just fantastic work, both on this project and also, I think, generally in many different capacities with ISW. It's been an honor to work with such a great team. Anything else?
That is all.
All right, so let's on with the show. Fred Kagan, director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, and Brian Babcock-Lumish, who is the director of the Hertog
Petraeus Center,
but also the Hertog Fellows Program, right?
Yes, the Hertog War Studies Program.
There you go. We'll talk about the report and give you a briefing on its content. Fred, Brian, Kim, myself, Leendert, Stephen, and Ruth Gordon in the back, who is the wizard of the entire day's event. Thank you, Ruth. A stalwart ISW team who couldn't be with us today, Irina Verity, who has been just a tremendous resource for us all the way through. We were all part of the team that kind of created this. And Fred and Brian, take it away.
So, as Dan said, we had a fantastic team working on this project, and many of the folks dialing in right now are participants from the 3 roundtables we had here in DC, in Brussels, focused on the Russia problem, and in Honolulu, focused on the China problem. In particular, while I'm here, what Dan also mentioned was the Hertog War Studies program is sort of the flagship educational program within the Institute for the Study of War. And I want to take this opportunity to thank 3 of the alumni of that program, Nils Ringler, Tim Hofmackel, and Nils Peterson, Tim Hofmackel, and Noah Ringler. The 3 of them volunteered a year's worth of Monday nights and weekends of writing time to help be the intellectual engine driving this project along. And the rest of the co-authors, we couldn't have done it without their tremendous work. So I wanted to thank the 3 of them since they're here today. Thank you very much, guys. Now, the project itself was working from a fundamental premise that we have the 5 domains of warfare that everybody's used to: air, sea, land, space, and cyber. But we think that the 6th domain of warfare ought to be the information domain. And that was the premise we put to all of the roundtable participants in all 3 venues. And there was not universal agreement that we should, in fact, do that information should be treated as the 6th domain. But it was the starting point of our conversation. And what we did was we recognized that talking about cyber as the 5th domain is not synonymous as talking about information as the 6th domain, that those 2 are not in fact synonyms. And much of what happens in the information domain is not present on cyber, right? Things that in the real world happen, people chanting slogans at protests is part of the information domain, not captured by cyber. And so we don't want to solely focus on some of the things that people gravitate to in the information space that are replicated on cyber. You know, things like misinformation, social media, right? All those kind of things. Those can be a part of both information and cyber, but they're not synonymous. And we also recognize that there is this sort of Goldilocks paradox when we're talking about information as a 6th domain of warfare, that we don't want to either define it too narrowly or too broadly. Because if you define it too broadly, it becomes meaningless. But if you define it too narrowly, you miss out on some of the critical things that are what makes the information domain worth understanding and conceiving of as this sixth domain of warfare. Now, another premise of this research project is when you think about a busy decision maker, whether that's a political leader in a national capital or a combatant commander in one of the geographic combatant commands in the US context, they walk into their headquarters, whether that's the Situation Room in the White House, at Indo-Pacom out in the Pacific. The commander can walk into a Joint Operations Center, look at a map on the screen, and understand the first 5 domains we talked about: air, sea, land, space, and cyber. But how do you have a common operating picture of whether you are winning or losing in the information domain? And that was the fundamental problem we have started to nibble at with this year-long project, is thinking about how is it that you can actually visualize information as a sixth domain of warfare. Now, there are 3 sort of buckets that we consider in the report of the types of information operations that we want to consider: military deception, directed persuasion, and narrative construction. Those are the 3 that we sort of lay out as 3 types of information operations that we need to be able to graphically depict so that that decision maker can understand whether they're winning or losing. Now, I'll turn it over to Fred for this next piece of the discussion. And what we did was we drilled down on the Russia case, in particular the war in Ukraine. And Fred, if you want to give a little bit of sense of what we saw play out in the Russia case and how that informed this set of panels.
Thanks, Brian. So, as Kim said, ISW's been tracking the Russian aggressions against Ukraine since 2014. And so we've been following what the Russians have been doing in all domains of warfare ever since. This brings me back to my old Sovietology roots. One of the few things I'm actually professionally qualified to do is talk about Soviet stuff. And the Russians have unfortunately given me the opportunity to do lots of that. They seem to have forgotten a lot of Soviet doctrine that was actually quite good, which is good for us. But they latched onto something that was good for them, which is a concept called reflexive control, which is extraordinarily relevant to understanding their approach to hybrid warfare, their approach to information operations, and the departure point for us as we begin thinking about this problem. And the Soviets defined reflexive control as so shaping the adversary's understanding of the situation through all means, informational and physical, that the adversary willingly chooses the course of action we prefer, thinking that it advantages him. So the adversary chooses what looks to the adversary like the best possible course of action, but it's actually the best possible course of action for us, us being the Soviets in this case. That's the Soviet construct of reflexive control. And that has been the heart of Russian hybrid warfare, has been to shape the narrative space, shape the information space in such a way that we, the West, all of Russia's adversaries and friends, chose voluntarily to do the things that most advantaged Russia, thinking that we were doing the things that advantaged us. That, as is customary with the Soviets, they developed theory and doctrine for how to do things far in advance of anyone else's theory and doctrine, in my judgment. And so we took that as our point of departure for looking at what they were doing vis-a-vis Ukraine. And they had accomplished very significant gains long before this invasion, long before the lead up to this invasion. One of the most stunning successes they had was the way that they worked themselves into the Minsk II process with the Germans and the French, because the Russians conducted a skillful set of negotiations and information operations, as a result of which they were formally recognized as impartial mediators in a conflict in which they were in fact belligerents. But the Minsk II Accords recognized them as impartial mediators, as if they were not the ones who'd actually invaded Ukraine. That's a pretty remarkable achievement. And that was a part of their hybrid warfare campaign, fueled by this approach to reflexive control. So we had all of that in the back of our minds, or the front of our minds in the case of Russia team at ISW. And we watched it and we observed it and we reported on it until we started to see the lead up to the actual invasion. And then we saw an amazing phenomenon, which I think is the first time in history that we've actually had a phenomenon like this. The Russians conducted a series of coherent, planned, coordinated information campaigns to set conditions to achieve their objectives in Ukraine if they could get the Ukrainians or us to surrender in advance, and alternatively to set the best conditions for an invasion if they concluded that they needed to do that. And we observed these various Russian information campaigns, which were very, very detailed and thought out. These were not just throwing messages out there. That wasn't the fascinating part. That was impressive, but that wasn't the fascinating part. The fascinating part was what the Biden administration did. Because the Biden administration, and this is what I think was novel in history, actually conducted an extraordinarily skillful and successful counter-information campaign, the pre-bunking campaign, that sought to defeat in advance each of these Russian information campaigns. And they succeeded. The Biden administration largely defeated the Russian information operations leading up to this war, which failed to achieve the Biden administration's fundamental objective, which was to deter the Russians from invading. So there was a theory, I think, that was prevalent in the White House that if they stripped the Russians of informational cover, the Russians wouldn't take the action. That turned out to be false. But by defeating the Russian information operations, the Biden administration set conditions that were maximally propitious for Ukraine and for us to support Ukraine, and maximally disadvantageous for the Russians as they went into the invasion. And that was a very important accomplishment. So we studied that, we reported on it in great detail, and we realized we are observing this, we're living this day to day, we're seeing it, the people in the White House are living it day to day, they're seeing it. There's no way to visualize this. There's no clear, obvious way that we were aware of, or still are, even to score it, actually. We could give we could make assessments about who was winning, and we could provide data and evidence to support our assessments, but we couldn't demonstrate it, and we couldn't show it. And this got us to reflecting, if this were a conventional military campaign, there'd be a map. You would see that the Russians had lined up a whole bunch of units at one part of the map, and that they had tried to drive across a whole bunch of territory, that we lined up a bunch of units on the other side, that we'd stopped them cold or driven them back, right? Would have been straightforward. In this information, we had no ability to visualize any of that. And because I think what the Biden administration did is actually an incredibly important exemplar of what we will need to do to be successful going forward against Russia and China and Iran and other adversaries who will try to do this, it really spurred us on to say, we need to figure out this visualization problem. We need to figure out what the White House should have had, and I have no idea what they did have, but I'm reasonably sure they didn't have this, what they should have had in the sit room so that they could look up on the board and see which campaign was succeeding, which campaign was failing in a graphically, rapidly comprehensible fashion, and how these things all interacted with one another. And that really spurred us on to try to solve this problem, recognizing that it was a very hard problem as we had gotten into this. Now, of course, it's not only the Russians who do this. And so as ISW and my colleagues at ADI and I have also begun a project focusing on Taiwan and the Coalition Defense of Taiwan. We've started to observe what the Chinese are doing along these lines as well. And that presents an interesting set of problems that put a certain amount of weight on different aspects of the information space. So one of the things that's really interesting when you look into the Chinese information operations is that there are some very time-sensitive, very short fuse information operations that they conduct around particular events. And then there are very long plays that they engage in for decades of reshaping the narrative. And those have the characteristic that unless you really pay attention and really think about them hard, you don't even realize that you've actually accepted premises that are the result of Chinese information operations. This is particularly true when you start to ask people about what is the international status of the island of Taiwan. And lots of people will say, well, it doesn't have a formal independent status, which is false to fact. It does. Under international law, Taiwan is an independent state. The fact that the United States does not recognize it or have diplomatic relations with it does not strip it of that status under international law. It has been a major Chinese effort for decades to persuade people of the converse, and they have been amazingly successful at that. And very few people even realize that they are actually living in a gaslit world that the Chinese have created for them. And this has important effects for policy. Now, the Russians have done this in various ways as well, of course. The whole debate about Crimea reflects a long-term Russian information operation to rewrite history in various ways and rewrite international law in even more fundamental ways. But this combination of long play and short-term information operations is another aspect of this problem that we think is extremely challenging and that has emerged from both of these dynamics and situations. And that's been the other thing that's really spurred us on to try to solve this hard problem.
Yeah, the specific case that we have in the report when it comes to the Chinese case is Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last summer, not quite a year ago. And the way in which there was the interplay between Taiwanese and Chinese information operations, and the US to a degree as well, that's a really interesting case when you look at the way the Chinese were portraying their military exercises around the Penghu Islands, which the Taiwanese had to very quickly try to come out with information to say, no, that wasn't possible. Here's the map showing the tracks of where the Chinese aircraft were. They were nowhere near where they claimed to be in their information operation, right? Again, to the point, you can talk about that in the media, but there's no way to show it on a map for a decision maker or a commander to understand the interplay of those information operations. And that continued to feed into this year-long project as we were thinking about, well, how is it you ought to visualize? And one of the things that we still haven't fully figured out is what are the right data inputs that you need to have to then come up with a visualization? We've started to get after that, but that's a fundamental question that is important to think about is what are you trying to measure, right? What are your measures of effectiveness, measures of performance? How is it that you capture the data out there? Because we gravitate toward things that are highly structured already, right? It's easy to look at a graphic representation of tweets and retweets and all of that kind of stuff on social media because it's all highly structured data. But that, to say reality is Twitter is clearly not accurate.
Thank God.
Right. And if all you're doing is visualizing what's happening on Twitter, there is a lot you are not capturing. Right. And that's the challenge is people gravitate toward what they can measure. Right. It's like the drunk man looking for his keys under the light pole. Well, that's where I can see. Right. As the policeman asked him where he lost the keys, it's on the other side of the parking lot. So this is the problem we've been grappling with, and we don't have many answers in the report, right? We will talk about it after the panel. Some of our co-authors will talk about the fact that there's much more work to be done, right? This is just sort of the end of the beginning of this project is this year that we've spent thinking about how you visualize information operations. With that, I think we're ready for our panel.
Any questions for Fred before we bring the panel up? Any observations, Nancy?
One question from, Colonel Bryson from DCI. So I was at Shocker, but now I'm at DCI, General Glavy on battlespace awareness. So you mentioned the pre-bunking for the Ukraine fight. Are we seeing any of that for the China fight?
I think we've been a lot less effective in reacting to Chinese information operations. Now, for reasons that are a little bit complicated, I'll try to give you a short version of this, but it's an important question. The most Chinese gain from the information contest over the Pelosi visit was an American-owned goal. We suggested that it was a reasonable risk for us to consider that the Chinese might shoot down an aircraft carrying the Speaker of the House of Representatives flying into Taiwan. This was an insane thing for us to say. There isn't a world in which, in the situation as it was during that visit, the Chinese would have contemplated such a thing. And we should not have said that. And we actually advanced the Chinese effort to isolate Taiwan significantly, by saying it ourselves and taking it seriously, apparently. So now the Chinese had earned that luck, as it were, because they had created informational conditions in which it was reasonable in that context for people to be saying things like that. But it was, at the end of the day, an own goal. I think it was beyond reflexive control. I don't think they were specifically playing for that, but I'm sure they were delighted to have been given it. Now, that reflected a weakness that we have. So why did we fail there where we succeeded in Ukraine? Well, okay, because that actually touched on separation of powers. That touched on the fact that the White House doesn't get to control what the Speaker of the House does or says. And that's an aspect of our system that our adversaries are able to take advantage of. So for me, it widens the aperture of how we have to think about the problem of our own sort of engagements in the information space and the information domain, given the nature of our society and our system, and the fact that we're never going to be able to have a perfectly coherent congressional White House, reaction to anything. So that's what I took away from it. But I would say that dynamic, in general terms, has made it much, much harder for us to react effectively.
There's one more question in the back. There's one online. Okay, let's go to Jimmy and then.
Hey, Jimmy Anderson here at IBM, but also an Intel nerd. So pre-bunking. What I did see the three categories. Can you give me an example of the one of like a good? Is this just messaging like the Putin price hikes, or is it that type of
Pre-bunking?
Yeah, pre-bunking.
Yeah, no. Thank you. You mean you weren't following this every aspect of it? I can't believe that. I'm sorry. So the Russians were running a number of information operations and setting conditions to say that the Ukrainians were conducting a genocide or were preparing to invade Donbass, the occupied part of Donbass, and conduct a genocide. They were saying these things against the inhabitants there. And the White House began leaking, publicizing declassified intelligence that this was a Russian information operation, that the Russians were preparing to do false flag attacks in specific. This was specifically the pre-bunking was the Russians were preparing to set off bombs in their occupied areas that they would accuse the Ukrainians of having done. And the White House presented intelligence to the world saying, the Russians are preparing a false flag attack here to support this nonsensical campaign, which actually largely deterred the Russians from doing most of that stuff.
Yeah, helpful.
And there's one question online.
It's actually a two-part question. The first one is, who is the consumer of the information? The flavor of the topic implies the user is the administration, not military leaders. And then there's a second section. There's the topic of time scale. What happens over the long term, months and years versus short term?
Well, as with all domains of warfare, but particularly, I think, in terms of space and cyber, the information domain touches a lot more than the military, and it touches a lot more than the administration. Military commanders, military staffs have to be very heavily engaged in this domain, and are. And if you talk with our military commanders who are dealing with the Russians, they are very alive to the information operations that are ongoing and what they need to do about them. If you talk with our folks in Indo-Pacific, I think they're very alive to what's going on in that domain. I think they can probably use some help with that. Other folks in the administration, but it goes beyond that. The American public needs to understand this. American media organizations need to understand this. That they need. I think it's very important to educate all Americans, but particularly the people who speak to Americans, about information warfare in general, about information operations in general, and to give them all of the tools that they can be given to understand, and data that can be shared, to understand information operations that are being run on them. Because the agents of the most effective information operations are not the people who write the scripts. They're the media outlets who repeat the reports without understanding that they're repeating information operations of the adversary. They're administration officials who say things without understanding that and they're military officials who say or do things without understanding that they're playing into the enemy's hand. So it's for everyone. Everyone needs to see this. And that's part of the challenge as we're talking about.
And to that point, one of the things that we talked about at our roundtables is the fact that any of these visualizations needs to have sort of a zoom capability where you can go into the very tactical level to look at individual incidents, but you also need to be able to zoom out to have a 30,000 foot view to understand how things happen over the long term, right? Like an example in the Chinese cases, anytime someone says reunification of Taiwan, that's a successful Chinese information operation rather than saying unification, because it hasn't been unified before. And that's a successful Chinese campaign anytime you say reunification. So and that's, a specific example. But absolutely, you need to be able to do both short-term and long-term because of the way in which some of these, especially the narrative construction, is decades potentially in the making, not just the incident of a tactical event of, Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
All right, well, thanks very much. And let me ask Emmy, Michael to join us, and then through the magic of the information space, we will be meeting shortly our guest from Indo-Pacific Command, and he will be coming on the screen. There you are, Steve. All right, Steve, you want to say hello so we make sure your sound is working?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me loud and clear.
We can. Thanks, Steve. So we'll get to the introduction, and thanks so much for joining. So as Brian indicated, we had 3 roundtables, one here in DC over the Institute for the Study of War offices, one in Brussels, and one of our panelists was there. We'll introduce them, and one at Pacific Command in Oahu, and 2 of our panelists were there. And so it's my honor to introduce our panel, and I'll go from left to right. Emmy Probasco, who is a senior fellow with the Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Emmy focuses on AI and emerging technologies. Emmy came from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab and had a very distinguished naval career. So thank you for joining us, Emmy. Michael Rouland, recently relocated to DC, but still with European Command. He is the senior strategic advisor for the Russia Strategic Initiative with UCOM. You're also still an adjunct at Georgetown, right? Adjunct professor. There's a Georgetown theme going on. And Michael has had a very distinguished career. Also, he's been a senior historian in all 3 services, in 3 of the services of the military, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. So thank you, Michael, for joining. And then beaming into us live from Indo-Pacific Command is Steve Hunnewell. Steve is the director of the Information Office for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Steve was a key contributor and leader at our roundtable at that location. Steve comes to the service from a private sector leadership career, most recently in media analytics. He was also a strategic advisor in Afghanistan and an officer in the Army. So we have representation perspectives from across the services and expertise, both current practitioners and also leaders. So thank you all so much for joining the panel and following up on Fred and Brian's excellent description. So let's expand a little bit on sort of the framing of the issue. And Michael, tell us a little bit about how you would describe information operations as you've seen them, and why is developing a way to visualize them important?
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you to ISW and IBM for allowing me the opportunity to speak here. So appreciate that, and I'm excited about the work that you're doing. And I'll also give my government disclaimer here, which is that these are my personal views. They don't reflect the Russia Strategic Initiative, the US EUCOM, or the Department of Defense. So now with that out of the way, I'm actually going to quote a passage from the report, which I think is actually very instructive. About defining information operations, which are deliberate campaigns to influence others' wills, in which the mechanism of influence is not the use of threat or violence, but rather nonviolent, non-kinetic methods aimed at shaping others' perceptions, motivations, and convictions. In the information domain, human cognition is the key terrain. That's a good quote. So I like that. Now let me give you one similar. Which was actually kind of important, but we've forgotten about Gerasimov's thoughts on this topic. But a famous presentation he gave back in 2013, which we entitled in English, "The Value of Sciences in the Firefight." And he explained, quote, "The very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they've exceeded the power of force of weapons and their effectiveness." So it's a similar idea, and maybe the thread that I would draw, and it's actually why this conversation is so important about the future of warfare even, is that the center of gravity has moved towards the competition for the will to fight. Right? Influencing your adversary's will to fight has become, and that's back to Fred's comments in the first discussion here, the modern world order, we'll call it, space global order. We don't like war. We try to prevent war, right? Most modern great powers are trying to prevent war, or if in the worst case scenario you have a war, it's going to be short and sharp, right? So influencing the will to fight is obviously a competency of that war. So pivot a little bit now to a couple of thoughts on how do we depict it. Obviously, it's very hard to depict. It's nonlinear and nonviolent, non-kinetic. In real time, we have an instinct to try to map this out in time or space, but it moves at different speeds across different mediums, in different languages, in many different global directions. And so it forces us, in fact, we have to make choices about the kind of information that we think is important and at what scale we want to track these information, whether it's in messages or campaigns, et cetera. When we look at the Russian case, it's also very experimental. We say there's a lot of Russian information activity, and it may or may not be a serious effort, or that is to say, they may invest or double down on messages that resonate in some ways. So it's hard to track some of these things in some ways. But what we do see in the Russian case is that they generally perform well when they can seize the initiative and then go towards that space. And that's where, again, I think Fred's depiction of the initial conflict in Ukraine, being able to successfully respond to that attempt to seize the initiative is really powerful. But we may often be in that place. And so that requires us to see adversary activity quickly in order to identify it, refute it, expose it, and disrupt it as appropriate. Great, stop there.
Thanks, Michael. Emmy, any other thoughts on?
I think you did a great job of explaining everything, so I don't have too much to add. I think it's such a complicated area, and to what Brian said earlier with a commander, when we're talking in the military context, to be able to see it, to make a decision, you need something that effectively and efficiently communicates that information, but it's also dangerous because you can over-flatten the data, you can over-flatten the picture, and then come to the... So I think it's such a complex domain that you need some kind of a trick to get into it to make a fast assessment. And we have to just do it responsibly because it is so complex, but I think everything else that has been said is well said, so I don't want to.
So Steve, you are the leader of this space in Indo-Pacific Command. Any thoughts from you on this framing question?
Yes, and so first off, again, thank you to IBM and the Institute for the Study of War for having me and allowing me to participate here. And then also that the caveat that these views are my own. And so, yeah, just need to get that out of the way. Now that that is out of the way, so visualizing is crucial, and as was already hit on by Michael in terms of seizing that initiative and that first mover's advantage. So visualizing helps our commanders, and we're not looking to overly simplify. I think that that's an inherent challenge in this space as we look at the various data sets and the complexity of the data. Structured versus non-structured, online versus offline, but helping them to achieve that decision superiority. Oftentimes we talk about decision superiority only within the kinetic context, but here we require it within the non-kinetic context to help us achieve that first mover's advantage. And it is something that is extremely difficult. In another sense, and I look at it from this perspective too, as I look at resourcing and showing the efficacy of our programs. In order to do that, visualizing the information environment helps me to relay to policymakers the value of these efforts. And in doing so, and not to run the fool's errand of attempting to visualize the entirety of the information environment, and it was captured nicely in the report, is the need to bound, to build the effective visualizations, that bounding determined by the effect that we are looking to achieve. But not only does it help us to achieve those operational end states, and visualize that again to achieve that decision superiority for the commander, and really at echelon, but also to help us internally show these are the value of our various efforts, because oftentimes, as you see in the civilian world, what is my return on marketing value? You often have that fight between the chief marketing officer and the chief financial officer. We too have that value, or sorry, that challenge here of why am I going to invest in this type of a non-kinetic capability? Why am I going to quote unquote take on this risk, if you will, to conduct this messaging activity? And visualizing helps us again to relay this is your return on value, and yes, you actually achieved the desired effect, or no, you need to pivot because you did not achieve that desired effect. I'll close there.
Thanks so much, Steve. So let's go to another point that Brian made about information and cyber and sort of other things that people often think about, social media. Now we have AI that sort of we talk about. Emmy, can you talk a little bit about differences and similarities you see?
Yeah, so I thought the way that the report characterized it and the way you characterized it, Brian, at the beginning, yes, the information domain is cyber and social media. That's sort of, yes, and there's so much more that goes into that domain. You can think of cyber as a channel. You can think of social media as a platform. There are multiple different platforms within the social media ecosystem. There are lots of other ways to reach people in different channels. Sometimes they're cyber, sometimes they're real world. So there's just a lot that I'd say cyber and social media are a little piece of, but not sufficient to cover. And a big part of that is that while you have channels and you have platforms for getting out content, and anybody who, Disney knows content is king. Generating that content, making it viral, making it sticky, that story that kind of goes along the channels and the platforms is crucial to understanding this particular domain. And the stories are, I could give you wonderful metrics like, there were 100 million views of such and such Twitter message. Well, what's the Twitter message? It depends. So characterizing that I think is really important. And you can construct those narratives or construct those stories. They can be real world events, amplifying real world events. They can be staged real world events. So I could create a real world event that I can then construct into a narrative, or they can just be completely fake events that I have constructed in various ways, which brings us to AI. And so I'll cover all the bases on the horrible things, but then talk about some of the optimism with AI as well. I thought what Stephen was talking about with the chief marketing officer remind me of something I was just talking about this morning, that when the chief marketing officer is talking, they're like, I know that I'm wasting 50% of my ad budget. I just don't know which half. Except that AI now makes that less of a problem. So now we have a much better understanding of who is the target audience, how does that target audience operate, how can I reach that target audience, stories work with that target audience, and then make that, the CMO's job maybe a little bit easier, a little bit more targeted. Of course, AI allows you to do that targeting in some uncomfortable ways where we have the various companies have collected data. They use that data in order to tailor content. And now we can tailor content in whole new ways. So if you have not yet played with Stable Diffusion or DALL-E, those are the two generative AI platforms where you can type in, my son put an obelisk with an eye on the ocean, and we got 5 different images back. So you can do lots of really interesting things. It is very easy. I can do that at scale, and I can do that with a relatively low skill, and it's relatively inexpensive. You can do fake videos. Some of you have seen the deep fakes where it looks like it's President Obama saying something completely ridiculous. Those are also getting much easier and much better. It used to be, I used to work with a bunch of designers and videographers at the Applied Physics Lab, and they could look at a video, and because they were so trained in that area, they could immediately tell fake from not fake. They can't tell anymore. It's extremely difficult, and then it's much easier. And then also, of course, there's fake voices, which if you haven't been listening to what's going on in the music industry right now, people are starting to license their voice so that other people can create new songs using their voice without them actually singing it, which is a really interesting business model. But if you imagine some of the other fakes where we're using somebody you know's voice in order to target you personally to take some action, AI makes these things easier to do and scalable in a way that they weren't previously scalable. Okay, so that's the bad news. I'm sure we could keep going on that. But there's good news too, and I think it's important to remember that this is a wonderfully exciting new technology and we can shape it to the good. There's a little bit of, I think, an arms race going on in terms of fake, not fake. So generative AI and the universities have encountered this where all these students are faking their essays, and then other researchers come up with ways to detect the fakes. So I think there'll be a bit of an arms race in creating fakes and then detecting them. I think there's also a lot of potential with information fusion, and we've already started to see that come to pass. Where you can use AI to go out and fuse together, or not even just AI, sometimes this is just using the data properly and then having a platform in order to bring that data together. So we can start to take information about what we see in social media, plus maybe it's overhead imagery, plus news reports. You can take disparate sources of information much more easily, piece those together, and now you have a different view of what ground truth may be. So I think the way that AI can support decisions and decision making, whether it be at a tactical, operational, or strategic level, those things are opened up in a way that they were not previously. And I know that there are a lot of people experimenting as they should. Just to make sure I cover all the buzzwords on your bingo card for AI today. There's also computer vision, so the ability to use computer vision to go through large amounts of data. That can be overhead imagery, where I'm trying to find exactly a weapons platform or a mobile weapons platform, for example, using overhead imagery. Or what we've seen in Ukraine, and you all know this better than I do, but we've seen a lot of open source images of a tank going past a particular landmark, and then we can use computer vision to try and geolocate, or you can just take the metadata off the tweet, but you can also use computer vision to do a geolocation. So there's a lot of hope, I think, when it comes to using AI to map out the information domain and to start to bring together all the disparate sources of data that could potentially be used. And I think we talked about zooming or unzooming. For me, it's layering or unlayering the data so that you can start to get a better understanding of the picture. And there's just so many different technologies that I think are coming together to help us there. I should have said at the beginning, by the way, I speak on my own behalf. And I don't work for the government, so it's a little easier for me.
No, very good. So I will note that as an IBM executive, I will speak that 1 month from now, a little less than a month from now, in this room, we're going to have a whole day around AI ethics and new evolutions of AI, use of generative AI in government applications. So if anybody's interested in continuing that part of the discussion, something that we as a company care deeply about following ethical principles and the use of AI with all of our work. And so the issues you raise are very important and will be continued in that setting. Steve, any other observations, including from your commercial experience on this question?
No, I mean, I would say it was captured extremely well. Just to reiterate, and the report captured it again in the appropriate manner, in that they're complementary, but yet different disciplines. They're interconnected with the intent to leverage and influence beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors to achieve that desired end state. Cyber, when we look at the cyber means for us, we categorize it and bin it to help us. It is not the complete picture, but to help us when we conduct our social listening. So that's trying to understand and achieve what we're talking about here today, and visualizing the information domain, so the social listening piece. But again, it's capturing only one aspect of it, being the online dialogue. And then cyber also helps us with the engage piece. That would be our second bin, so actively engaging. And then our third bin is that sense making, or determining some efficacy to our efforts, so on and so forth. But again, it is simply one aspect of the overall information domain, and not the totality of it. That's the only thing I would add there.
Thanks, Steve. And let's stay with you for this next question, which is focusing on, Brian sort of talked about zooming in, zooming out. And we talked in the roundtables, especially at Pacific Command, around 3 different communities that could leverage visualizations: field operators, analysts, and then senior decision makers. Given sort of each of those roles, what do you see as the value for different kinds of communities from these visualizations?
So again, that layering or that echelon is crucial, and in this, because you also saw this in the CT context in terms of this inversion of expertise, these tactical actions that can have these strategic effects. So having that capability to really delve into and bring the nuance to the tactical operator, that will then achieve and inform that strategic decision makers calculus, and help to inform them. But also having that layer, having that removed and being able to visualize for the strategic level. This is the longitudinal, as was already discussed, and I'm glad that it was captured. When we look at these longer term plays, so the example brought up about reunification, vice unification, That is this long-term drumbeat approach that's looking to just tick away. And so having that ability to visualize that at the strategic, that's not necessarily something relevant in terms of day-to-day tactical, where you're getting down into that granular of target audience analysis. How do I get on a screen? But for those longer term strategic approaches and seeing the effect longitudinally, you need to have those differentiators, and then understanding what data sets are relevant to each, and then doing the proper weighting to understand what conduits, pathways, and then speakers would necessarily be weighted appropriately for each. So to achieve a tactical effect, you may have an outlet, a speaker, an influencer, so on, that's weighted disproportionately. Vice, if you're looking for a strategic effect, if G goes out with a certain phrase, how do we relay that in terms of the strategic view there? So having these, the layered, the echelon, the various looks, or at least the ability to deep dive for the various equities is crucial in terms of this visualization, but also in the last piece, in terms of the senior decision maker being able to distill it into that snackable content, if you will, so that they can achieve that decision superiority, so that they can make a decision when they have all of these multiple competing requirements is crucial. A difficult task, but a crucial one.
Steve?
Michael, any other thoughts? Sure. So I would just highlight again, similar to Steve, being able to articulate the nesting or the echelonment of the strategic, operational, and tactical operations is really critical. Having worked for a few senior leaders that like to have lots of complex information on one piece of paper, being able to depict that is actually really important. And so, one sort of challenge to us is, even as we think of, operations, information operations that we may be very familiar with, do we have a good sense of our kind of our top line messages nationally, and then operationally, and then tactically? Sometimes we tend to focus on those specific areas. And then do we also appropriately understand where our neutral parties or allies or other partners are also operating at all three levels at the same time, in addition to our adversaries? And being able to map that out is something I think the report certainly highlights, as we sort of looked at. And the great quote there is the static visualization of multiple information campaigns nested under the strategic and grand strategic objectives. Sometimes I feel like we ignore this ourselves. And again, to look at it across all of those other parties makes it even more complicated. And again, we're kind of think through where we need to be perhaps in the future on this is that integrated view. And I think that's the challenge. I'll just say, having now observed, so Russia's new foreign policy concept just came out. And so again, where they talk about, multipolarity, again, this is part of what I would describe as a grand strategic, information campaign. Maybe it's just strategic and it falls underneath others, but they're reaffirming this idea of Russia as a great power with a historically unique mission to maintain the global balance of power. So these are very lofty ideas. And so if we were to say that, so Russia's grand strategic vision is to be a great power into the future, how do we depict that on, do we understand that as a top line message? And do we see all of the campaigns that Fred mentioned earlier underneath that? And again, because that's a multiple centuries long campaign. And so again, as a historian, I like to think in these terms, but that's obviously something that sometimes people lose sight of. What's the really important objective for states? Because that's the area that we're talking about.
I'm really stuck on Stephen's comment about snacks. I think I can visualize the commander needs to snack on some data, and it's not just the senior leaders at every level. They're snacking on data. I love it. And what we need is basically a nutrition label for the snacks, because the data is crucial. And I think very frequently, especially when folks get their hands on AI, they assume the data is correct and then they run away with the decision. And that is enormously dangerous. CSAT, where I work, we just recently put out a blog post because there has been some, we think, not very helpful analysis. There's a lot of red v blue analysis that's going on right now in terms of emerging technologies. So who's further ahead in the technology? And one of the ways to try and assess that is to look at the academic literature. It's a huge data set of academic literature out there, and try and infer who's ahead in which particular domain. You do this by looking at the data, natural language processing, different kinds of modes of attack. You can really mess that up badly. Because you don't understand the way that Chinese academics publish versus the way that other countries publish. You assign different metrics to what influential publications look like and what non-influential publications might look like. So I think we need these nutrition labels on these data sets. And also, there's another way of looking at it. So being former Navy, and I think this might apply to the other services, we have, with the major weapon systems, your capabilities and limitations documents. Every weapon system has capes and limbs. And as an operator, you understand my system does this in this situation very well, and in this situation, cloudy day, not so good. And you learn how to operate within those constructs. We have to treat data sets, I think, in a very similar way. The commercial industry has done that to some extent. They call them data cards for data sets. That's one of the approaches. But we have to train from the tactical to the strategic level. These are the capes and limbs of the data that you have. And also, these are the capes and limbs of the algorithms that you have, the models that you build off of that data. You cannot assume, it's so tempting. You see the data and you see the answer and you think you understand and you want to run with it. The one that I really detest the most is the sentiment analysis on social media. If you've ever looked at sentiment analysis on social media, it tries to flatten the conversation into they like you or they don't like you. And it's just not very good. The models are not good. It's very suspect. I'm sure there are a lot of people working very hard because it would make a lot of money to get it right. But I haven't seen anything good, and you have to be very careful. So to the snacking point, I think helping at those different levels understand what you can rely on, what you can't rely on. And then one other thing that had to do with the different leaders, because I remember, when you work for different senior leaders, they all make decisions in very different ways. And as a strategic advisor, you sit there and you figure out how they make decisions, and then you shape all of your presentations to fit their mode. And what's great is with technology, we can do that now. We can make interactive platforms that you can optimize for the way that you make decisions. So having that kind of flexibility, again, and it's not just, now we have the luxury, it's not just for the senior leader, you can give it for the tactical operator, help them manage their picture, give them a UI that allows them to make the best decisions based on the way that they make decisions. So just building on both of those previous comments.
That's great. And we'll come back to that at the end when we talk about next steps and how we actually move from this analysis to actually developing kinds of prototypes. Let's pick up on your point about there's differences in how like a Chinese academic would handle things from a Western analyst, vice a Russian expert. And given the different geopolitical contexts in the two regions we're talking about today, and also globally, should we think about a visualization strategy as a global imperative that's kind of tailored, or should there be multiple visualization strategies depending on the region? So sort of a tactical, strategic. Michael, you want to?
Sure, I'll jump on that one. Probably not with a helpful answer, but more questions. I think when we look at some of the major actors in this space, they all operate globally, and so, but they do it, and that is to say, they include the United States. Do it with regional characteristics across multiple languages. And so that, coincides with the way, especially within the military and the way our geographic combatant commands are set up. Even with senior leaders at the national level, we tend to think very much in regional terms. And so there's a little bit of a tension between the operating globally and the importance of a lot of decisions that are made regional, with regional implications. As I say, the space that information operations become significant, I think at the level that we're talking about in this conversation now, you're kind of hitting that tension between the global and the regional operations. And so I would just say that I think there's a value in uniformity, so that as senior leaders move across these spaces and deal with different regions, having uniformity is really important. But you can't ignore all the regional characteristics, I think, that are in those spaces, because that's really, I think, where a lot of important decisions are made.
I think Michael's got it entirely right. The only other observation, just to amplify what you said, is that the media environments, the way that information flows in these communities, even within the United States, there's sub-communities where information flows in a slightly different way. And so I think there's a lot of value to having a global, so that any commander, when they rotate every 2 years, can airdrop in and figure out which way's up. You still need that tailored knowledge of this is how information flows through this particular group, and these are the sorts of messages, sorts of stories. I mean, even, going all the way back, the mythologies are different, but they're kind of the same, but you need to understand how they're different. And so that nuance, I think, is just really important for practicalness.
And Steve, I would imagine that in addition to differences unique to the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, there's also within region variations that you are in your role kind of discovering.
Yes, you definitely have that micro segmentation, but really taking that broader view, it's crucial to have that trans-regional understanding. It's something that we're grappling with, and Michael did a perfect job there in identifying that as a true issue, because these actors are conducting their inform and influence campaigns in various GCCs, and we are trying to do the deconfliction, but we all have our own ways of capturing data, visualizing data. So yes, we do need to understand the local markets, how information is conveyed and consumed, but from a strategic perspective, we would also like to, and this is something that we're grappling with, understand the totality of their, and I'm speaking to a pacing threat here, their investments, how they approach it trans-regionally. Do they have a disproportionate investment in a certain area, vice another? So yeah, it's truly, as we've already hit on multiple times, echelon and layered.
Thanks, Stephen. And we have one more formal question, so we'll get into a Q&A period next. I hope that people on the chat are putting questions on, and also hopefully they're commenting and maybe including some links that we can learn from as well, so that people we're getting extra content from our online participants. That's always a great feature of hybrid events. So let's just Brian talked about that we didn't solve the problem in the report. This is just the end of the first phase and the beginning of the next phase, but we did include some criteria that came through in the different roundtables, and tried to kind of summarize some of them about things that you would want to consider as you're developing visualization. So whether it's those criteria, Steve, we can start with you, or others, what kinds of technical criteria would be important in terms of government, industry, and academia to work on in starting to think about how do you actually frame these visualizations?
First for us is the compatibility of the technology, the platforms, where we can have government, industry, and academia all being able to access a singular platform. And then building on that would be our allies and partners' ability to share data, to inject their exquisite and unique data sets into that, and to be able to access it as well. Clear communication, standardization of data formats and data sharing protocols would be another key feature. And then the ability to scale and prototype and iterate to the needs of the different users. So Again, the tactical may have very specific use cases that they could iterate off of and improve out versus operational and others. And just reiterating the point on the iterating, flexibility to adapt to the changing requirements and priorities, as it's almost as if we need a JIDO like construct, if you will, for technologies related to operations in the information environment. And what I mean by that is a rapid fielding capability, because the data sets, particularly as you're looking across regions in the online realm, I mean, they're rapidly changing, trying to get into WeChat, trying to get into TikTok, and then how do you assess these data sets? And then as new platforms come online, and then and then for us, obviously, I'm looking from my perspective is who's funding, who's resourcing, and ensuring that it's not a one-off, but can I make something that's funded not just for this fiscal year, but will be funded for multiple fiscal years. So when we look at the technical criteria, those are some of the factors that we're looking at, and really just that last piece too. How do we ensure that we can sustain it over the long term?
Great.
Yeah, so my perspective is going to be a little bit different and more as a consumer of the information, but the technical criteria, two particularly important ones I think that are flagged in the report. So one is the dynamic visualization of the information campaign, depicting initial state, assessed objectives, major lines of effort and progress along each line, which is essentially a depiction of ends, ways, means. And then another is the ability to depict inflection points. I say, sign me up. I'd love to have that. I think that would be very useful. I would just challenge, the difficulty in actually depicting that. And so again, just go back to Fred's example from the opening, which is, the initial kind of the information campaign between Russia's sort of denial of an invasion versus the U.S. sort of highlighting the possibility of it. And again, if our objective is to prevent a war, if we see that and we fail in that, do we actually understand how that information campaign plays out, not just vis-a-vis Russia, but also others in the world, including European allies? And so again, we may achieve, if we set unrealistic objectives for ourselves, do we actually understand all the dynamics of that information campaign? And there are a lot of successes in ways that we didn't anticipate, perhaps, through that process, some of our key allies. And that's really important to develop, understand as we kind of learn from these efforts.
So you said just to pick the most important, so I'm going to try and only pick the two most important technical issues that I think you could really have an interesting or important conversation. The first one's over the user interface, user experience. I think at these different levels, we need the vendors, the technologists, the researchers to be working with the operators to understand what do they need, how do they work, how do we help them. I think it's easy to presume, okay, the UI should look this way or that, and frankly, the military historically overlooks, it doesn't write requirements for UI, UX in the kind of way that we think about it for a commercial sector. I just think and not only is it just, let's get it so that it's a efficient workflow and you can make decisions with the data that's put in front of you. There is having the UI UX tailored in a way that I can make the decision. So there's a bunch of things going on in trustworthy AI right now, and there's a debate around explainable versus interpretable AI. And we put explainable aside, I'm going to stick with interpretable. Can I understand what this computer is trying to tell me? Can I understand what the AI is actually recommending to me? Can I do that under time pressure, which is a very different operator construct than if I'm sitting in a command center? And they're really interesting and important studies that I think we can look at from medical, where you're also making high-risk decisions, and they're also starting to use AI. We're finding out about the ways that you can manipulate or coach the human through the UI. This is just a really important area because you've got the data and the analysis, and that tends to be where we want to get focused. But that point of interaction could be where a lot of things roll off the tracks. So I think that UI UX would be one really important. And then with that, my sort of connected but second is assessment. We can make every visualization you've ever wanted to see, but did it make a difference? Did it actually predict where you were going? Did it help you with your decision? And are we looping back what we learn and adjusting based on what actually happens? Assessment, I think, is a still big open question, and that really does take academia, government, or the operators, plus the vendors working all together.
Thank you. All right, questions?
A lot of questions. Hey, Steve, great to see you again. This is Colonel Adam Bryson here from DCI. So 3 specific questions. And I think, Michael, I'll just spit them all out and then you can, who in the U.S. government is responsible for information? Because we said it's got to be strategic, all the way down. And I will tell you, as a colonel in the Marine Corps, working with Mr. Hunnewell and others on, trying to do the operational and tactical side of this, we lack that broad guidance. And then we don't have an information command. We got a cyber command. We got a stratcom, right? Like we don't have an infocom. Right. So who is responsible? Because when I talk to my peers at like Mar4 PAC, I'm sure Steve, you've heard this. Not my problem. Like I've got enough to do. So, and then, ma'am, for you, you mentioned the data cards, the nutrition labels. I thought that was fantastic. But who would be responsible for that? Right? Who? Again, back to higher level. And the last thing is just a pitch for, again, Marine Corps Systems Command this summer is working with the Defense Innovation Unit on a CSO, commercial solicitation, on specifically generative AI and PAI OSINT tools. And they're looking for partners, right? So the Marine Corps is committing, a little over $1 million to that. And the more partners we can have in that with Defense Innovation Unit out of California, the more prototypes we can develop to support the overall effect. So questions in a.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for representing the Marine Corps point of view. As well.
Okay, Rob, the impossible question. Well, again, I guess sitting in the Department of Defense, obviously, it's a very good question. Obviously, it doesn't rely, it's not nested in the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has a lot of capability to operate in the space, but it's a national responsibility. I think one of the challenges that we see as this becomes more of an issue, or at least as it becomes more important in warfighting, is the fact that there are other parts of the government that are inadequately funded to address these issues. And so as we think through, into the future, as other government agencies become more active in the space, and are better supported, that's where I think the Department of Defense has a responsibility to help coordinate in their role. Certainly, it's not a military decision, and I think that is an important distinction in this discussion.
The data card.
Data cards. I think, so I'm a former Aegis sailor. Everything I think is in Aegis terms, but I think it's the vendor and the training commands. The vendor understands the technology at the sort of scientific level. The training commands are the ones that need to help translate that. I think vendors writ large who use AI are going to have to find a way to do documentation well. So that, to me, those data cards are one of the deliverables that go hand in hand with the training commands. You also mentioned you're looking to bring in OSINT and PAI for an experiment. So I just got back from a really fascinating trip with the 18th Airborne, and they're doing something similar. So if you haven't chatted with them, I think they're worth chatting with. But I've been looking at the probably many of you have seen the AIP, the new Palantir demo on a large language model for querying. I don't know how much of that is real. I saw the video like everybody else. So I think those sorts of experimentations have have to happen so that we can get smart on those systems. I think Scale AI is another one that's playing with it. But, bringing them on board, trying them out, finding out those capes and limbs before we get too far down the road, and then chatting with the 18th Airborne would seem like good ideas.
Steve, anything else on this question before we go to the next?
Yeah, just in terms of who's leading within the government. So as Adam hit on, it's a challenge. So you look at the elements of national power. You have clear leads for the other ones, except for the I. And looking back at the CT context, you did not have a clear lead, yet you had this unity of effort across the government, and you had a combined joint interagency effort. Again, all lock and step in terms of that unity of effort. It is something that we are lacking here, and even within the department. So my position in this office here at Indo-Pacific is unique in that it looks to bring together the entirety of our capabilities across the USG spectrum of influence, but they are still very much siloed capabilities even within the department. So even as we go down into Department of State, Vice Department of Defense, within our little silos of excellence, we're echo chambers within echo chambers. So it's a holistic challenge that I would say we need to place more cognitive bandwidth against to solve at the national level, because we lack that unity of effort against this.
So interesting. I'm going to step out of moderator hat for a minute. When I was in my government career, I was the senior information policy official at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. And a position like that, potentially in that NSC, could be something that would be that structural recommendation that we might think about going forward. At least one person in the room remembers when I was that, because he was the CIO at DISA. Good to see you again, Henry. Okay, next question. Anything in the room?
Yeah, I've got one. I mentioned this earlier. You guys have stumbled onto what I think is an existential challenge right now, getting this right. And you described, I wonder, I'm not entitled to ask this because I haven't read the report yet, but it's a different measurement in terms of, you talked about regional and global, but this is really, there's sort of three big, I would think there'd be three big target sets. Domestic, which we have a tough time measuring, and our adversaries have a very easy time controlling. Global, and then sort of adversarial. So what are the information operations? What's their impact on the adversaries we're trying to influence? And so as you worked through this, were you able to think how those measures would be different? We do have, I think one of the experiences with sentiment analysis, and I agree with you on the online part. I spent 3 decades in CIA, just from my background. And we did a version of sentiment analysis that you guys are probably familiar with that was quite effective when you were on the ground in those areas, able to measure a little differently than you would clicks and responses. Did your sort of research advance to that point that you're looking at? Because it's a thrilling challenge.
Yeah. Fred or Brian, do you want to?
We have given this issue a lot of thought, and we are very alive to the requirement to have ways of measuring effectiveness and visualizing the effects on multiple audiences, and the sort of the score with multiple audiences. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is the reflections that emerge from the fact that the information space isn't particle. And people continually think that you can deliver messages to one audience and have them not bleed over into other audiences. The Russians, weirdly, have struggled with this in a bunch of very obvious ways, and we struggle with it too. And I think we did actually get into some very interesting conversations where we got a little crazy. We started talking about fluid dynamics as a model for thinking about certain aspects of audience segmentation and
Weather map.
and weather maps and other ways of, but trying to sort of think outside the box in terms of how to deal with on the one hand, the segmentation issue, but on the other hand, the fact that it's all a continuous medium in a certain way with sort of differential gradients, generated by language and locality and sensibilities and various other things. So I don't know how far I would say our research advanced, but I think we had some discussions that we found pretty interesting about
Here in the report. So please join me in thanking a terrific panelist. Now I'd like to introduce Leendert Bochoven, the leader of IBM's global defense technology work. And can we get, thank you, Steve. We're going to take you off screen. Can we bring on Stephen Gordon? As Leendert's talking, Leendert, why don't you go ahead and start while Stephen's coming up.
First of all, I mean, indeed, this is a fascinating topic. And that's actually how it started. I would say it was a luncheon where Stephen Gordon introduced me to ISW, to Fred. We had a luncheon and we actually started to brainstorm about this very thing because we have a real interest in terms of how do commanders make decisions across land, sea, air, space, cyber, and now suddenly this whole new information domain. So that's how this really all started. And by the way, this doesn't just play here in the US. This is a NATO issue as well. I mean, these other nations have the same questions, maybe not at the scale, but certainly the same types of issues that we see. So, and at this point in time in 2021, I mean, Stephen introduced me to the already famous Institute for the Study of War. And now your fame has grown so much more since then. So we are delighted, and thanks for that incredible partnership that we've had over a year and a half now doing this together. So, but it's a thrilling challenge indeed. And yes, we still need the map. Please. So our call today is all about how do we continue this? Because this is the end of the beginning. This is all about, we need to double down on this one here. And again, today's conversation has again proven that, I think to me, that this is an area we need to get our brains around. So with that in mind, Stephen actually had some ideas about how to move forward. But again, this is a conceptual idea, and we really want to make sure that we include partners here and say, now, how can we really do this together rapidly? So, Steve, do you want to come in?
Yeah, good afternoon. From the IBM Think conference, I apologize to everybody in the room and remotely. I couldn't participate in person. I'm here for the next 2 days. If you think technology discussions around the table is the leading edge, after this conference and what's it's going to make its way into the news is going to blow your mind even further. So it's getting unbelievably sophisticated. So I don't know if Leendert is showing the screen, but let me just frame the challenge. So as a non-resident fellow at Institute for Study of War, working with Fred, Kim, and the analysts and the different research teams, trying to come up with some new technologies or techniques that meet the problem here that we've discussed so far. And, this is beyond the bar chart, it's beyond the pie chart, the graph, the numbers, even to some degree, the three-dimensional views or different types of ways you can look at data in different layers. This is such a different problem that it requires almost a different paradigm of thinking. So Fred can attest, and Kim as well, that we looked at this problem initially from a story crafting perspective. So I heard media, I heard AI and technology, and those are all the right elements to discuss. But if we back up to how do you actually visualize a narrative first, right? We tapped into some colleagues and people we know at Pixar, and nobody does movie making and storytelling better than Pixar. There's a reason why everybody in this room and on the phone knows who Woody is from Toy Story. No matter what age and what part of the world you are in, you know that toy. And you know his order in the toys, in the movies, and probably more than what I let on here. So if you think about this initially from a storyboarding perspective, and then the characteristics of an information operation, which has, short list here, tempo, it has characters, it has a world, past, present, future, or all the above. It has an arc, which means there's a start, there's a middle ground, and there's a resolution, or in the movie parlance, a sequel and another sequel. And there's alternate endings, there's full feature animation, there's short movies, there's 2-minute shorts. So, we frame the problem in sort of the light of a cinematic design. And let's look at the narrative first, because this is an ongoing problem that slows up, it speeds down, it has a summit, and then it's sort of built around this theory that this is not my formula. This came from Andrew Stanton at Pixar. This unified theory of 2 + 2 is do not give the decision makers on the other side of the picture or the audience, don't give them 4, give everybody 2 + 2 and make everybody work for their meal, in his words. So put 2 and 2 together. So, and I think we discussed that when we share insights with whatever tool that we're using today. We're not saying these are the answers, that these are data-driven insights. This is a human decision-making. We're just presenting this for your consideration. So if you look at this journey, you can see there's digital hotspots along the trajectory. It's very much a nonlinear progression because there's tools and there's tradecraft and there's ways of looking at things. But this collective idea, if you think about the artisans and the craftsmen that are required to put together a movie, it's lighting, it's story, it's character development. It's actually clay modeling people that just design characters from clay, storytellers, marine biologists, outer space experts. So you have this incredible, almost like turbocharged defense innovation unit type of a construct who organically don't typically come together outside of making movies. So this collective idea that Leendert, myself, Fred, and the team have sort of kicked around and now have a structure around, has the characteristics of next horizon skills and tradecraft that come together to solve a problem. Almost next level center of excellence, but skills you just can't find that typically don't come together. So that's what Leendert is showing you here as he kind of goes through this process here. And I don't know if Leendert, if you could show the 631 kind of a model, but someone mentioned earlier, and I loved it, is that we've got to get after this fast, and we got a prototype, and this can't be a year-long, 2-year project to produce something. Let's look at 6 craftspeople, 3 months of time. A business quarter is a good unit of measurement. 1 breakthrough. So we're not trying to solve, the drug discovery method of Pfizer. This is the way you should be working. This is not the brass ring, so to speak, to use it just as an example. These are quick, fast, bring in teams of people who know how to get after this and put it in the mindset of a DoD framed problem. So that's the spirit of what this collective, which we're just calling coalesce. It's coalescing information, skills, partnerships, and the output is an MVP, a prototype, or something that you can put your hands on. Somewhat of a departure from the typical way that you would engage industry or integrators to do something. This is a quick hit with a different type of a lens. So I'll pause there for comments and maybe kick it back to Leendert or Fred and Kim for commentary.
This is very good, because we worked on this one, because we really want this to succeed. We really want this to progress. And so these are kind of sort of the initial ideas that we have around it. But again, we're looking for your inputs on that or your insights and say, hey, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. What is the best approach for us to continue working on this one here? Because we feel, and John, it's a thrilling challenge. It is, in our opinion, it is a thrilling challenge. Let's get our brain power around it and see how to do this, and how to mobilize technology to help decision makers in this incredible, difficult time. So I think that's what we wanted to share with you here today. So stay tuned on this one here. We want to continue. Let us know what you think. If you're willing to join, contribute, help. If you've got demand, maybe that maybe you already are talking about certain efforts where this could play a role. We're happy to join forces on that. So I think that's it for us. So for me to end the beginning of this program, this was a bit exciting. And I would like to really thank OXW for the incredible work that you've done. So Ruth, Irina is not here. So I want to recognize her that she made an incredible role, helped us so much with this whole program. So thanks, Irina, on our behalf as well. But Fred, Brian, and the team, thank you so much for helping us and guiding us on this important journey And of course, on our side, thank you so much as well for supporting that, and Dan for being moderator, host, and so many things in this whole process. So thank you very much. A round of applause for the oils.